told to me, a friend from town, and he told me of an experience that he had when he was a bit younger, before starting a family. And some of you may know who he is. Sheldon, you'll know. He worked for you for a period of time. Kevin Pauls. And some of you are already chuckling. You know Kevin Pauls. And he had given me permission to tell his story. And it was a few years ago when he had been on a skiing trip somewhere in British Columbia, snowboarding actually. And you're die-hard snowboarders. I've never snowboarded. I have snowboarded, and I did it once, and I went back to skis really quick. But those who are really into that, and are good at that, often what they will consider doing, and not just consider, but will choose to do, is to ski or snowboard off the groomed trails in the areas that are kind of marked as the no-go zone. And it sounds like it would be a very dangerous thing, and it can be. But if you're sticking together with a group and you remain in the clear areas, more often than not, you're going to be just fine. But sometimes there are things that are unforeseen that can happen and that can take place that are beyond one's control. And while skiing with friends, Kevin had drawn or snowboarded a little too close to a tree, and he fell. He didn't hit the tree, but he fell right by the tree. And this tree that he had fallen by, around that tree had formed a tree well. And do you know what a tree well is? Well, I think I got a picture of it. It's a cartoonish picture. But this is literally what happened to Kevin. And these tree wells, they're formed when there's a lot of snow. In mountains there's a lot of snow, and usually wind helps a little bit too. And these tree wells, they can become very, very deep. So deep, in fact, that at the end of a skiing season or a snowboarding season, after the snow all melts, what can be found at the base of these trees where these tree wells have formed is the remnants of deer and other kind of animals that fall in there and they can't get out and during those winter months. And this is what happened to Kevin. He had fallen down into a tree well, and he fell down upside down. And he was in head first, and he tried moving this way and that way in an attempt to get out. This is a very scary thing. And with each movement that he made, he would sink deeper. And he could feel the snow forming around his face. And he began to feel the panic set in. And it would be a very, very unnerving thing. For me, just thinking about his whole experience, it makes my heart pound a little harder. It makes me feel anxious. Upside down in snow, helpless to do anything for yourself, where every little move you do make just seems to sink you further and deeper into your situation, thus complicating your situation that much more. And this is where Kevin found himself. In Kevin's story, it ends well, as you've seen him around town. And one of his friends had taken a look back and he noticed that Kevin was no longer behind them. And so immediately he stopped and he looked and he saw that he went immediately to this tree that Kevin had fallen down into. He just saw this tuft of snow. It looked like a tuft of snow, not an obvious one, but what he thought was a tuft of snow that had kind of puffed up a little bit. And he went to that very tree, and it was exactly where Kevin was. He had fallen down in there, and they found him, and they dig him out, and they got him out. And I asked Kevin, what kind of an effect did that experience have on your life? And obviously it had a very profound effect. A very profound effect, because when I called him to ask for permission to use this story, on his desk, I called him at his work, he holds a picture. He has a picture of that skiing trip of that time. So that experience he carries with him. And Kevin, he's a fellow like you and I. He struggles with everyday things in life, as we all do. Frustrations of one kind or another. There's depression. There's desperation. There's things that we all have to deal with. Everybody has something they have to deal with. But in those moments, while upside down in that well, Kevin was making peace. He was making his peace. He was of the mind that while he was only there for short moments, that it was possible, maybe even probable, that in his being in the back of the snowboarding pack, that his friends who were going flat out, straight back downhill, were likely going to turn around to even notice that he was missing. But something made one of them turn and look back. And thank God for that. And Kevin, in those moments, after feeling the panic, he began to think, well, if this is it, then this is it. And he surrendered to that thought, and a calm came over him that was peaceful. And then he felt the digging, and he could feel the vibration on the bottom of his ski board. And he knew that someone was digging for him, and they pulled him out. And he said, that he was convinced that on that day, that somebody bigger than himself was looking out for him. And as said, there are still days that are difficult. There are still days that are challenges. But there are days that are also so very awesome. And that moment will go down in his memory of a time that he had escaped a very awful fate. And he was given a second chance. And he knew that someone was looking out for him. He believed that. And he's been forever grateful to still be here among the living. And has there ever been a moment like that? Like, not exactly like that, but similar to that in your own life, an identifiable and defining moment where you knew that God had drawn near to you in some way or another. You were convinced, you knew it. And that became a moment for you that you would always remember. So when something would take place, or when life became challenging because of one thing or another, that mere memory of that moment that you had was something to draw from. It was something that would come back, and it would give you hope in the very time, at the very moment that you needed that hope. Because you knew, and you were convinced, that in that moment you could recall, God had brought you. God was right by you. He was right with you. Maybe some of you have a moment like that very clear in your mind right now. And maybe some of you, maybe not everyone does have that kind of a moment that will come quick to their mind. And there are some people who want that moment, who want something like that so bad. Because a moment like that would never, ever make them doubt again that God is near. A moment like that would allow them to kind of cruise through life, through all the highs and through all of the lows. To cruise through everything because, with ease, because our faith would become just so firm because of a moment like that. Because of that undeniable moment that we would remember when God had drawn near. But you know what? The truth is this. A moment is not enough. And this is also true. God has drawn near. He has drawn near to you. He has drawn near to me. And all that is needed is to call out to him, and he will be there. He is there. He is here. And that means something. It means something for you and I, doesn't it? The story that Terry Michelle read for us today, she read of a blind man by the name of Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus, he had been healed by Jesus. And now stories within the Gospels of healing in particular, they often focus on something. They focus on establishing the identity of Jesus. And blind Bartimaeus being healed by Jesus, that certainly does that. It reveals his identity. But there's more to the story than that too. As a healing story, all of the normal elements are there. Someone has a problem. There is some kind of factor that makes life complicated. And Jesus provides the cure. And there is some response that is then made to the miracle. However, within this story that Mark tells, I think that Jesus has more in mind. I think that Mark has more in mind as he tells the story. This is not simply a story of healing, but it's a call story. And Bartimaeus is an example of what true discipleship is, I think. And his story is not told to us just so that we would know or come to an understanding that Jesus is getting better at this whole healing, performing miracles and so forth, that he's getting better at it as we move forward and further and deeper through Mark. But rather, we discover that Bartimaeus received full sight immediately after calling out to Jesus. Often what we see, or what we can see as we move through the pages of Mark, is that gaining full sight about Jesus' identity often takes some development. It takes some time. Take Peter, for example. For instance, we've been reading through Mark in our lectionary over the last month and a half, I believe, maybe even more. And Peter, for example, whom we had read of a few weeks ago in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus asks his disciples this question, he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" Remember that passage when we read that a while ago? Who do people say that I am? Well, and his disciples, they respond, well, some say that you're John the Baptist, and there are some that say that you're Elijah, and still there's others that say that you're one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, okay, but who do you say that I am? And it's Peter who responds to that question, isn't it? And he says, you are the Christ. That's who you are. You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. And Peter makes his confession, his declaration of belief, declaring the identity of Jesus, of who he believes Jesus is. And he says, you are the Messiah, the Christ. And then what follows in just the next few verses from that declaration is Peter goes on to rebuke Jesus for claiming that his messiahship will follow a path of suffering and death. And then there's James and John. I don't know if this was read last Sunday, or maybe it was the Sunday before. But James and John, they're in the story that just precedes the one that was read for us today in chapter 10. And earlier, and again, Jesus is speaking. He speaks of his suffering and his death that he will endure. And then he says that he's going to rise in 3 days. And the identity of Jesus is just beginning to cement among the disciples now. It's getting there. It's not quite there, but it's on the way. And after this, after Jesus makes this comment about how he will rise in 3 days and of his suffering and so forth, they make this head-scratching request, James and John do. And it says this, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in glory." In your glory. Now that is quite a request. And I can't help but wonder, Peter, James, and John, the inner three, I can't help but wonder what they thought and believed of what it meant to follow Jesus. Because there's a real contrast to be seen between these three and our blind man Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus seems to get it. He seems to get the identity of Jesus. He seems to know who he is. And when he understood that Jesus was near, he calls out. Yeah, he's calling out to get his attention. There's no doubt about it. But he seems to know something. He seems to know who he is. And he calls out in such a way, and this is what he says, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." You know what? This is the first time that I think I can recollect, or that I can come across, certainly within the book of Mark, when the term or when the title Son of David is applied to Jesus. And it's clearly a royal title. And it's referring back to none other than King David, Jesus' own ancestor, the line from which he came from. And the next time this title is used is when Jesus enters Jerusalem, where he's given that royal Davidic greeting again. And Jesus poses the same question to Bartimaeus as he had to James and John. "What do you want me to do for you?" And James and John, they unwisely and uncomprehendedly, they ask for positions of honor and glory. But Bartimaeus, in contrast, asks for sight. And whether he's asking to see for the very first time, or whether he had seen once earlier and wants to is asking to regain sight, I don't know. But for me, Mark's emphasis is as much on spiritual sight as it is on physical sight. And once again, the story of Bartimaeus, it's a call story as much as it is a healing story. For he acknowledges who Jesus truly is, and he believes in Jesus and in his mercy, and he gains his sight. And even more importantly, upon receiving his sight, he then has the insight to know what he must do there, what he wants to do. Follow. And following Jesus is crucial. And most telling, at the end of this story, we don't find the typical reaction or to a healing miracle where a person is healed or the crowd witnessing the miracle responds with awe and praise. Instead, what we're told is this: immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Immediately Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way. And where is the way headed? Well, in the very next chapter, in chapter 11, we find Jesus entering Jerusalem, and he starts a chain of events that ultimately end up at the cross. And Bartimaeus exemplifies a disciple who sees where the way ahead leads, and yet he follows still and believes Jesus through it all. And the story of Bartimaeus, it is a call story. It's a story of Jesus calling Bartimaeus long before Bartimaeus ever calls out for mercy. And Jesus drew near. And when Bartimaeus became aware that he was near, he called out. And for us, for all of us in our own lives, whether it's in solitude or in loneliness or in depression or desperation, we're not alone. Jesus is always near. He's already drawn near. The thing of it all is, will we seek him? Or will we remain blind to the reality that he is near and active in this world around us? And what is the way? What is the way? The way is Jesus. And our response to the way is to seek him and to follow. And Jesus has come to this world, to you and I, to liberate us from all that holds us captive, from the stuff that is like chains on our wrists and our ankles. And it's a miracle. It's a miracle in itself that we can have peace and joy in this world despite all of the hurdles and the griefs that are within it, that sometimes are thrown at us. And this is far more than a mere moment could ever provide, that we can have peace that passes all understanding, that we can have joy in the very midst of extreme hardship. It's a miracle. It's as much of a miracle as being healed from blindness, to have the joy and peace and an assured hope that comes through holding hands with Jesus as we walk with him day to day. But we will remain blind. We will remain blind if we do not follow. So then how do I follow? Well, Jesus said again in chapter 8, he tells us how, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. It's really through a complete surrender to your Creator, a complete surrender to the Savior, to Jesus, and a surrendered heart. I think it looks like this. From Matthew chapter 5, remember that great Sermon on the Mount that Jesus began? And he preaches out what we have come to know as the Beatitudes. Well, I think a surrendered heart, we can work with the Beatitudes a little bit. Can you just flip forward, Kevin? That's hard to see it all, I get that. But we know what the Beatitudes are. Blessed are the poor in spirit and those who mourn. And I think, and it goes on and on, but I think a surrendered heart coming out from the Beatitudes, it will be like this. It will be poor in spirit. It will mourn. It will be meek. It's going to hunger and thirst. A surrendered heart that is what will reflect that of a peacemaker. It will be salt and light in the world by doing good things. A surrendered heart is not going to hate. It's not going to judge. It's not going to indulge in anger, but it's going to seek to reconcile. Surrendered heart is not going to lust or be unfaithful. It's not going to presume to make vows, but it's going to be simple in its talk, where yes is yes and no is no. It's not going to seek revenge, but it's going to find creative and non-violent ways to overcome evil that is done to them. A surrendered heart will be as such where one will love their enemies, as God does, and be generous to everyone, as God is. It will give to the poor. It will pray, fast, not in an open and showy way, but in secret. And it's not going to be greedy, but it's going to store up treasures in heaven through generosity. It's not going to worry so much about our daily needs. It's going to be assured that God is going to provide all. And this is a tough call, you know. This is a tough call to follow. This is a tough call that's been given to you and I, but this is the way of Jesus, and who could ever disagree with it? And we know it's not easy. But you know what? We're not blind. We're not blind. Jesus is near. So will the people follow. And what would happen if in our world, if increasing numbers of people were practicing living this way? What would happen if in this world, in our own individual lives, if we didn't just hear the words of Jesus, or we didn't just simply say, Lord, Lord, but rather we heard his words and we acted on them? And what future, on the other side, can we or might we predict for ourselves or for our nation or for our planet if we reject Jesus' way in practice? Now this is Reformation Sunday, 498 years later. And so may the spirit of the Reformation live on in the lives of the people of Jesus' church through following with great fervor and with much passion, that flows from a humble love for God and that spills over for others, that spills over for our world. This is the way of the call. And where is your heart in it all? May it be for you, for I, for us all. May it be a surrendered heart to our Lord Jesus Christ. And a fitting way for us to conclude our time here would be to sing that great hymn, I surrender all. So let's sing together.